Welcome to the next episode of Integral Review. As usual, here with me, David.
What's up, interwebs? How you doing, Aljoša?
I'm doing fine, and yourself?
Doing well. We're here today to talk about our buddy and listener, Mario.
Yeah, this is going to be the first one for our Integral Review. We're going to actually engage an audience member, if you will, who is actually my Austrian neighbor. I'm from Slovenia, and he's from Austria, so he's probably not really far away from me. So I'm going to say hi to Mario just because he's my neighbor as well. And I also want to thank him for doing our response to the Peterson podcast.
I'm also going to tell you that this is our second time recording this. This is why it's taken us so long to get it out, because the first one is Integral Review's lost episode or something like that. It got ruined, so we're doing it again. Since then, I've listened to the new Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson talks and started to do some editing on that. So I feel like I'm kind of glad that the first version of the podcast got deleted, because I feel like maybe he watched that already and I hadn't, and so now I have a better idea of where he's coming from. And so, hey, maybe this is good, right?
Yeah, maybe it was more of a blessing than a curse, right? I think, yeah, the new Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson talks really do bring maybe a bit more clarity to the issue of what Mario was saying.
First, I really appreciate what Mario has done here. Not only has he spent a good amount of time it took to listen to our podcast, but he really took it in, he thought about it, and he spent the time, like another 2 hours at least, to make his response back to us. So there's a great amount of investment of time by Mario, and of course we'll put his link to his videos in the description and all that below.
Of course.
Props to Mario for doing the hard work and for coming with such a legit and skillful response to what we had to say. It's really engaging, and it's not talking trash. It's like engaging with the ideas, and he's telling us what he thinks. And so props to you, Mario. Thanks so much for putting in the time and the work and the effort and really engaging. I really respect that. You've done a great job.
Thanks, Mario, again for taking the time. It took us, me and David, a lot of time to make that Jordan Peterson podcast. I think that was one of our longest talking sessions. So yeah, for you to sit down to listen to our 3-hour podcast and to make a response video, not trashing us, but just talking about ideas, I am definitely grateful. So thank you.
You know, if anything, if I could also talk about like a point of criticism around this too, on the other side, since we're integral and we're not just discussing ideas, but we're discussing aesthetics. I mean, I know like especially in rational conversations, there's a lot of value put around the idea of not making it personal, no personal attacks, just stick to the ideas, deal with the points. But as integralists, and especially with such a good job that he would have done, I would have liked to have heard a little bit more about him, and I would have liked to hear him say hi and say who he was and what he's doing, and like a little bit more personal stuff actually in there from him would have been nice, because he seems, you know, he's a really cool guy, and I would have liked a little bit more, maybe like even if it was just embedded in some of his examples, like for me in my life, I drive a truck, or I don't know, whatever. But that's a very subtle criticism. It doesn't take any points away from any of his arguments. I'm just saying. What do you think about that, Aljoša?
It's hard to say. You can get an idea of what kind of personality he has. He was very concrete. He was like, these are the points, this is what I'm addressing. We don't really know who he is, right? So obviously I would like to get to know him more as a person, and he never really brought that to the table, but I understand. He was just like, these are the points, this is what I want to tell them, which is fine, you know. If that is his style, I don't have any complaints.
No complaints here. Just would have liked to know him a little better. But let's continue on.
Ladies and gentlemen, please. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I come with an important note from the editor. He wanted me to let you know that because Mario drives a truck, the audio quality is going to be slightly below par in this episode, especially when he is speaking. We so much apologize for this, and we appreciate your continued listening to this podcast, and we promise that we will try to have higher audio quality in the future. Thank you so much for your time, and now I will return you to the regular program.
So I also really like that he did this first point, like point 0. This is my general approach. This is what I'm thinking about this. Couches what he's saying and his intention and his approach. That really brings a lot of insight and clarity to me into what's going on with a lot of the things that he's saying. So he says he wants to discuss ideas for ideas.
Hello, David. Hello, Aljoša. I want to make a few comments on your podcast review of Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. Let me start by saying that I really don't want to get into fighting over who's right interpreting Peterson. I'm not really interested in being right about my interpretation of Peterson. What I'm more interested in is discussing ideas as ideas and discussing their value, independently of whether they are now Peterson's ideas or not. Now, I will attribute the following ideas to Peterson simply because I got inspired with them by Peterson, on the one hand. And on the other, I think that they're compatible with his bigger picture place where it's coming from and thinking from. So I have tried to take into account his entire oeuvre, most of his lectures and his written materials. So whatever interpretation I come up with that I find to be more interesting or in some way more rewarding than some of the interpretations you suggested, whatever interpretation I come up with, I will try to make compatible with his bigger picture. And another principle that I'm following when I'm interpreting Peterson is whenever I don't know what someone is saying, what he actually means in a specific context, I just try to think about an issue for myself. I just try to figure out what the most reasonable position on a specific topic might be, independently of what the author has to say. And then I come back to reading the author again and see whether what I find to be the most reasonable conclusion on a specific topic might not in some way be compatible with what the author is saying. And if one of the available interpretations of the author is somewhere on the lines of what I find to be the most interesting, most compelling view on a specific subject, then I usually tend to attribute this position to the author, even though it is one of several possible interpretations. But I assume the author was right. I really don't want to get into fighting over who has the right interpretation of Peterson. I don't think this is important. Peterson is not as important as a person. I think it's much more interesting to discuss ideas as ideas and to discuss their merit, whatever they have to teach us about reality, independently of who holds them. The present-day discourse in general is much too focused on who says what and then fighting about whether one has really interpreted someone right or wrong. And I don't quite get that. I don't understand why. Why would it be so important to truly know what someone says or what someone means? You can go wrong two ways. You can have bad ideas on the one hand, and on the other hand, you can attribute ideas illegitimately to someone. So you can be actually wrong on two accounts. Well, if you focus on the validity of ideas themselves, you can be wrong on only one account, whether the ideas actually in some way are useful.
But then a lot of the points that he makes, 11 of the 14 points that he makes, are about what Peterson actually thinks, right? And I think he gets him wrong in a lot of these cases. Even though he's saying he wants to discuss ideas for ideas, a lot of these points are about us getting Peterson wrong. You know, we'll still go into them, but in terms of where he's coming from with this point that he's really interested in talking about ideas for ideas, I think that's fine. You know, we don't need to harp on who gets it right or something like that. But we are going to, since he brought these points up, we are going to talk about these points. And, you know, hopefully, ultimately, it does help to this higher end of getting at ideas for the sake of ideas. And I think this is also where I want to say that I think that it is important for the sake of ideas to really understand what people think, because I think a lot of what we're doing as philosophers is almost building these archetypes of different voices in our heads and thinking about how different philosophers relate to other philosophers, what they think about each other's projects and how they're reacting against them or inspired by them or whatever. To understand this bigger picture of the unfolding story and to really understand what a philosopher thinks and to have them as a solid archetype in your head means you have to really understand what the person says and what they think. And so I think it's important to both discuss ideas for ideas and also to really understand what these people say. One of the main problems that I see coming up here is what I'm calling giving the transrational benefit of the doubt or transrational projection, right? And I personally have done this for Wilbur for a long time because I heard him talk about transrational distinctions and describe what they were, but then at the same time, when I heard him talk about other things, I wasn't sure whether he was speaking poetically or not. For a long time, I gave him the benefit of the doubt until I realized that no, he really means this literally.
That's a literal colon. That's not a symbolic thing. There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth. And it's that sense of I amness.
I think part of what's happening is that you say in your video that, like, if you listen to a person and you hear what they're talking about, then you experience a version of what they're talking about, then you'll basically give them credit for the deeper understanding that you got out of it. I think that's maybe giving a little bit too much. It's overly gracious. I think that's a problem. These people who lack the lingo, as Jordan Peterson would say, they lack the real ability to grasp these things and make distinctions around them. And so when we just say, oh, they kind of get it, then we're giving them more credit than they probably deserve. And it's really important that Peterson and Harris get these things, and that's why they're having these talks, and that's why everybody is so excited about these things, is because it really matters. Which, I mean, you know, he's all for getting the good maps, because of course these ideas matter.
I think the bigger somebody's audience is, and let's be honest, Jordan's audience has boomed since, I don't know, 2015 or whenever he became popular, then the more important it is not just to understand his ideas. I think Mario was saying that it doesn't really matter who brings up the ideas. Well, I think in this situation it does, right? You need to understand where this person is coming from as much as you can from based on what he's saying. Obviously, nobody knows Jordan Peterson personally here, but I think that is important, who says what about what ideas.
I think we want to know what the different variations on the theme are. We want to really understand what's going on and what the different possible inflections are. It's important to know what people think because we're not just concerned with crafting one correct view for ourselves. We want to really engage with others. And that means really understanding what other people think. And he says, you can be wrong on two accounts, but this doesn't mean we should only focus on ideas and not try to understand what people actually think. Like I said, I think philosophers can be like these dynamic archetypes in your mind. And when you really can get what a philosopher thinks, you can be like, what would Nietzsche say about this? What would Ken Wilber say about this? Like once you get these different people in your mind, you can kind of bring them to task. So I think it is part of building our map is to also understand what all the different possible inflections are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's also extremely important if you try to put yourself in a position of whoever philosopher, to not try to bring your own interpretations in. I think this is what basically Mario is doing. He's reading in his own integral ideas into Peterson, like you were saying, and it's not something Peterson would necessarily really say if he was brought into the situation where he had to explain something like that. And like I said, this is basically the main problem I have with Mario's interpretation of Peterson. He's seeing that he's, I would say, integral projecting things to him that are not really there, at least not yet.
And let's be clear, what we're really saying here is that Mario is smarter than Jordan Peterson, and that he is more clearly articulating these important distinctions than Peterson could because he lacked the lingo. Even though we're being somewhat critical of where we think Mario might be going wrong with some of this stuff, big props to Mario. He really is quite skillfully able to articulate some of this stuff. I was very impressed.
I was extremely impressed by that. I was like, Jesus Christ, this guy has done some fucking reading or whatever. He did something. So yeah, kudos to that. Totally.
This is also why we're reviewing his thing, is because he did a good job. And I mean, we also want to be the kinds of people who welcome a conversation and welcome an open debate. And if anybody does a really good video or criticism or something like that, we'll engage with it. We want this to be an open conversation. So hit us up.
And this doesn't just apply to Mario. Everybody who feels like they want to do a video response, doesn't mean we're going to actually respond to everybody, but we will try as much as we can to have a conversation if anybody has any kind of criticism or has something to add.
Yeah, it's not a promise, and also maybe we in the future would figure out some kind of other way to respond. Maybe we'll have like Twitter or a Facebook or something in the future. We're still getting it started, so we'll probably be upgrading here soon. You think so, Aljoša?
We'll see. I hope for the best, yeah.
So let's move on to point number 1, yeah?
Okay, the first point, I'll start with mine, and then you can go with yours.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so first point was on becoming a person. Basically here, Mario, if I remember correctly, was talking about Jordan's ideas, which I feel are useful in terms of becoming a person.
You guys said that you think Peterson is somewhat of a reductionist and not really covering the right quadrants in this book. This is partly right, but I think it's also intentional. The goal of this book is to give you a basic tool set that helps you become a person. I think this is one of his strengths as opposed to Sam Harris, but both acknowledge consciousness as a reality. I think Peterson has much more to say about how to build a personality, how to make a personality work. He has much more to say about specific incentives and what attitudes to have towards life, what specific steps to take if you want to become a person. Being a person is not trivial. Being a functioning ego is not trivial, and he deals with it a lot in his clinical work. There are so many things that can go wrong in this account, in this area, and there's so much to be said just about how to do it right. And the ego in the Western tradition has a very positive connotation. The ego is not so much meant as attachment, but the ego has the meaning of being that which is able to sustain a sort of coherence over time. The ego has largely positive meaning in the Western psychological tradition. So what he's trying to build is a functioning ego. The best case scenario of which is to become an agent who is able to recognize himself as an ego, to recognize himself as a conscious agent, has become in part self-transparent to himself. Remember that the goal in psychotherapy in Freud is to make everything ego that so far was unconscious. So the state of unconsciousness is the starting point where you're driven by specific motives you're not aware of, but the ending point is to make everything ego, to make everything transparent. And this is a very, very different way of using the term than it's usually used in Buddhism. This is the major goal, I think, of the book itself. I think it's legitimate, and it's not surprising that most of his suggestions, most of his incentives are actually left quadrant oriented. It comes with the territory. And I don't see Peterson denying the existence of the right quadrants, nor do I see him denying complexity as such. What I see him saying is that you can learn to become a person even without having been able to fully grasp the complexity of the world around you. You can become an agent who's able to develop and who's able to become aware of his own shadow and integrate it without necessarily taking a right-hand approach, a right quadrant approach to reality, which is much more complex. And we are really very far from having figured things out. Building a personality in this way is simply simpler. It's easier than dealing with all the quadrants, and it's a logical starting point.
But I'll do say that you have a lot of people writing millions of self-help books in the same way like Peterson is doing. If you read any of the books from James Collins or Robert A. Johnson or I think Robert Moore and so on, they're all sort of doing similar things to Jordan. And in fact, in this case, Jordan really doesn't bring anything original to the table. That's something I wanted to point out. So he was saying it's important to do shadow work and, a lot of things that develop your ego. And it's important to do all those things in terms of practice or practical use. So doing individual change is all at this moment one can do on pragmatic level. But I just want to point out what Sam Harris would usually say. The fact of the matter is, and this is something that postmodernists sort of figure out, is that your ego is just a combination of systems you grew up in, and doing individual change will not help you with larger social problems. And even though Mario would probably say, well, Jordan Peterson would to some extent agree with that. For instance, I remember when Jordan had an interview with Russell Brand, they were talking about the problems of capitalism, and Peterson believes that having moral people on top of the chain will solve the problem of capitalism. But he can't see the problem that the system itself is creating immoral behaviors. And our ego is just a byproduct of a system. So again, I'm not saying capitalism is bad. Obviously, this is by far the best system we had if we compare it to the past. But postmodernists are right to say, hey, this system is somewhat getting old. We have a lot of problems. Capitalism is collapsing on itself. And just doing individual change and you just trying to be a good and moral person at this point is not enough. Even if everybody acted totally perfectly moral according to the Bible or whatever, the system will collapse, and we gotta prepare ourselves to navigate those waters, and just cleaning your room is not gonna be enough. That's what I have to say about this point.
Well, what I heard him saying was something about Jordan Peterson being really good for building an ego or developing for especially younger people who are at earlier stages of development. This stuff is good for them. And I think we made these points. I think we made a lot of these points. I think we were very gracious about, we were very gracious, but also kind of pointed and critical. I think at one point I said something like, if you're in the game of development, if integral is the top of the mountain or something like that, and you're coming from convention trying to get into postmodern, that Peterson is the boss you have to beat, something like that, right? But at the same time, yeah, he is good for people who are at these lower stages of development. It's interesting, though, because this makes me think back to that point in the Sam Harris-Peterson debates, these more recent ones, where Peterson says that traditional religion is for stupid people.
But so then you're basically saying that the stupid people need their myth. You know, we smart people on stage don't need them.
Right.
But
Well, look, I actually am saying that to some degree. If you're not exceptionally cognitively astute, you should be traditional and conservative.
That was a shocker to me as well. It seems like it was pointed at that direction, right?
Yeah, and it is kind of a developmental realization, and I mean, he is kind of being honest about that. It's like, I'm actually surprised that he's being so honest about that.
I was really shocked, yeah.
Yeah, he said it twice, 2 nights in a row, but I digress. Maybe we should move on to number 2, unless you had something more to say.
No, that's pretty much it. So number 2 is learning to focus your attention through goals.
So let's return to his suggestion to clean up your room first. Since the suggestion is directed at creating a functioning personality, at creating an ego. When you want to build a personality, one of the major abilities you have to develop, independently of your particular talents and independently of your particular personality traits, is your ability to focus attention. One major feature of being a person is agency. And agency is not something that you're simply born with, but you can develop these. You can develop your ability to focus your attention. And this you do by overcoming obstacles. This you do by focusing on specific goals, overcoming them. And in overcoming these obstacles, you receive gratification. Your brain rewards you, actually. And you feel like you're getting somewhere. Peterson is speaking about this again and again. So formulating goals in your own personal life, learning to focus hard, it's not something trivial. You have to learn it. And this is something that any consciousness that wants to be successful at whatever basically has to do. So I don't find it very convincing to say that, well, there have been people who have been successful in life without starting with this, without cleaning up their rooms. Well, cleaning up their rooms in this context can mean several different things. But if you mean by cleaning up your room, to start with something that you can focus on and start with a challenge that you can actually overcome. If you don't approach the world in this way, focusing and setting goals that are attainable to you, you will end up in a state of permanent negative emotion. And if there are people who have been successful at doing something without taking this attitude, without having developed their ability to focus and to set themselves goals, then I guess it's really due to extraordinary talent, luck, other influences like position within the social system and so forth. But it's not something that you can count on as a subject. It's not something that you can tell everyone who's a conscious creature as a general rule. It simply applies to very, very few people. And even the examples of the people that you name that are successful at something, I doubt are incapable of focusing their attention and overcoming obstacles and having clear vision what they want. I'm pretty sure they actually have this ability, which of course is just one small part of being a person. Peterson wants to make you a person. He doesn't want to make you successful in some specific area. He wants to make you a responsible agent, which is a different goal from the goal of, say, making you a successful filmmaker or a successful scientist. There are many ways into being a successful scientist without being an integrated person. I think it's the most logical point to start, actually.
Again, this is like basic self-help stuff, which, like you said, I totally agree. Jordan is great, and there's actually like some proof to that. There were a lot of people who, and I think I mentioned that on our Peterson podcast, who wrote him emails thanking him, saying, Jordan, you saved my life with your book and your work and so on. So obviously his work has a huge impact on people. So nobody's denying that what he's saying is useful to certain types of people, but it's not useful to all the types. And I also feel like his work, for instance, the 12 rules, to somebody like me or somebody who's like at postmodern stages, I feel like it's too condescending, it's too traditional, and people might feel turned off on such a book, I guess. And again, I didn't like notice integral ideas Mario was proclaiming they were inside, right? So that's sort of what I had to say. I'll say more, but maybe you can.
Okay, well, I was hearing him say something about how Peterson's goal is to create a responsible agent, goals and success, and to get over depression and all this stuff. But I'm wondering, responsible for who and for what? And it seems kind of one size fits all and vague, right? And
Exactly.
my issue with it is that we're supposedly creating these responsible agents, but then, at least this is what I'm saying before that, it seems like he very quickly and often wants to disqualify critics, right? So he wants us to grow up and be responsible agents, but then when we start taking responsibility for something higher, he wants to shut us down and tell us to go clean our room. That seems to be a problem. Now, this is also where I want to say that I get like a slightly different feeling around Peterson after listening to his talks with Harris at these conferences than I had before when reading his book. Like you say, it is condescending. It's like, who the fuck do you think you are? Go clean your room. You don't know shit. There's a point in these video series where he kind of has this sort of tangent outburst around this stuff too. Like, who do you think you are? You couldn't possibly know anything about yourself.
At the end of all these conversations, I'm still not sure what you believe on that point, frankly. And if I'm not sure, no one out there is.
Well, I don't know why you would expect to be sure about what someone believes. How do you think that any one of you are capable of fully articulating what you believe? You certainly aren't. You are not. That's completely ridiculous. You're not transparent to yourself by any stretch of the imagination. You act out all sorts of things that you can't articulate.
But how about a best guess? Yeah.
You know, if you look, let's go all cognitive neuroscience on this, shall we? 99% of your processing is unconscious. You're not capable of articulating yourselves. If you were, you'd be omniscient.
Okay,
don't give me any nonsense about that.
But that is a. I've never heard so many people applaud an evasion of a simple question.
How can you be responsible if you don't know anything about yourself? He says you can't create your own identity in this kind of post-conventional way. It's just like too out there and everything. But yet he wants us to be a responsible agent. Again, there's nothing transpersonal about this. When Peterson talks about the Christ or something, it's about like living in integrity with the world or whatever. There's nothing beyond building an ego. That's why I say that if you want to move into these post-conventional stages, he stands in your way because you have to transcend and include that ego.
Again, I also feel like Mario sort of is a fan of, at least it seemed like it to me, like a fan of classical economics. Like there's an idea that successful people didn't learn by themselves, but by the environment around them, right? At no point, and again, this is the difference between what's useful and what is true. And this is again what postmodernists are trying to say. Your ego is just the byproduct of the system. In another way, your ego is the system. Your thoughts, everything that comes in your consciousness is a system. So again, it's ideas in terms of agency is a useful pragmatic idea, and within that spectrum Peterson has some very interesting and important and cool and useful things to say, so nobody's denying that. But I never heard Mario make this distinction that in fact most successful people didn't like intentionally become successful at all. They didn't use their agency better than average people. I mean, they did in a way, but you see what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah. And I think this is actually a good segue to the next point.
Sam has a very broad notion of science. Sam includes the left quadrants in his notion of science. When he speaks of science, he's not simply speaking about only the gathering of empirical data. He's of course also qualifying qualitative approaches as being scientific. And he's even giving value to literature in general as something that can tell us about poetic truth, for example. It's something that can tell us about truths that are concerned with subjectivity or truths about subjectivity in general. Sam made this distinction recently where you can have objective truth about objective facts, but you can also have objective truth about subjective facts. Subjective facts, of course, are facts about consciousness or facts about culture. This is something I say even though I have the impression that in general Peterson to me seems to be more integral, in the sense that I think he has more to say about the left quadrants than Sam. Even though Sam admits the existence of the left quadrants, if you look at his work for actual facts about consciousness, you will find very little, apart from the fact that it's indubitable, that it exists. And this is a meager result. If you look at an average phenomenologist, on the other hand, you will find a much more detailed and much richer description of first-person reality than in Sam's work. You don't find any incentives on becoming a person, for example, in Sam's work. You don't find any detailed account of developmental structures, or of any structures of consciousness in general in Sam's work. So even though he admits its existence, the irony seems to be that he doesn't give you a really full-fledged account of consciousness. So if you wanted to know, give me in detail, what is consciousness like? What does it look like from within? If you turn to Sam's work, you wouldn't find very much on that, I think. Well, this might be intentional, but this might also have to do with what he focuses on, what he finds to be the most interesting topics. And this might, by the way, be one of the reasons why Jordan thought he was a materialist. Just reading Sam, who was insisting again and again that the starting point is consciousness. But if you look for actual descriptions, first-person descriptions about consciousness, you won't find very detailed accounts in Sam. You won't find anything that goes beyond the description of moment-to-moment experience, where he describes how the moment-to-moment experience looks like. He's not so good in giving you structures of experience. What are the foundational structures of experience? He actually denies, for example, free will. We'll come to that later.
He's basically saying that Peterson is more integral than Sam. And why does he say that? Because Peterson integrates a bunch of different things, right? But early stage vision logic does integrate. But the difference between Breen and integral, or postmodern and post-postmodern, is that integral integrates diversity with discernment. Peterson, he integrates poetry, but not skillfully. That's why he spends hours and hours and hours talking to Sam Harris, and Sam Harris tells him his concerns, and he just sits there and defends and dodges and dances all around, and Sam Harris says to him stuff like, why are you making this harder than it has to be? Just say that you're not playing these kinds of games and let's move on with it. But he can't make those distinctions. He even says that he's not sure what's true and what's not around this kind of stuff. He's not really as integral as Sam. At least Sam explicitly says that he gets data from all four quadrants and that he's including all of that in the fact of the matter. The only thing that he seems to be confused about is the map with the territory, a little bit of like the fact of the matter, as if our measurement of the thing is the actual thing, as if our words track one-to-one to reality. And this is actually the main and almost only point that Jordan Peterson brings up against him over and over and over again, is that it's just a relative value system or a way of talking about it.
There's a huge difference in the audience between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. Jordan Peterson is a teacher of kids fresh out of high school. That's why he's so condescending to his students. While Sam's audience is mostly well-read, rational, intelligent adults already. And so he's trying to help them develop a more transpersonal perspective, while Peterson is talking to less mature people at a lower level.
But so then you're basically saying that the stupid people need their myth. You know, we smart people on stage don't need them.
Right.
But,
well, look, I actually am saying that to some degree. If you're not exceptionally cognitively astute, you should be traditional and conservative.
But I digress again. What do you think? Do you think Peterson is more integral than Sam?
I just want to make the distinction of what's useful and what's true, right? For instance, it's not always true to say that if you focus your attention, you're going to be successful. So again, you're using this free market idea, well, if you focus on stuff, you're going to be successful. No, because system is stronger than you. You know, even if everybody listened to Jordan Peterson and applied everything Jordan's saying to 100%, you would still have fucked up people because the system doesn't let everybody really flourish. And that's what postmodernists are worried about. And this is something that Peterson, although in his later talks, he does understand that he was talking about hierarchies. He understood that hierarchies can be damaging, which in capitalism they are. For instance, if you have like 1% of people owning 50% of shit, right? Obviously, that's unhealthy hierarchy.
Of course, Peterson accepts scientific results as scientific results. He's looking at statistics all the time. He's looking at biochemistry, human physiology. He's constantly quoting them and trying to make them fit into his bigger picture, which is one of the reasons why I think he is integral, because he's not focusing on one quadrant. Even though this book, of course, is focused on personality development, he's not focusing on one single quadrant, but he tries to make the quadrants consistent with each other.
He does seem to be an interior reductionist, right? Because when he's talking to Sam about truth, it's like he wants to reduce everything to the lower left quadrant. And when we're talking about morality, he wants to reduce everything to the upper left quadrant, right? Like it's all about personal responsibility. Yeah, he does talk about facts, but again, the integration of these facts is in service, like confirmation bias style, in the same way that Christians will cherry pick facts that support their worldview. Like again, there's a major integration problem. It's not just that you include a bunch of things, but how and why you include them, right?
If we look at it from quadrants perspective, I think that Jordan is quite weak on lower right quadrant, right? And if we want to talk about Jordan being integral, you want to see those basics being integrated. I think his understanding of lower right quadrant is quite weak.
You know, there's that one moment in the talk where the moderator asks him, he's like, do you have some kind of method of integration? How are you making these distinctions? And they even offer up this metaphorical distinction to try and like give him a boost or something.
You talk a lot about the primacy of stories, and you are trying to get me to admit that I helplessly resort to storytelling to make my points, right? I think it's a good place for us to, and I don't want us to get bogged down, but I think it's a good place for us to touch this topic of the distinction between literal and metaphorical truth, which you might want to introduce it. But because that, in my mind, that covers this different emphasis on stories.
Sam believes that what should happen is that the poetic and fictional domain should be supplanted by the rational domain.
Well, let me just close the loop there. Not
Okay.
quite. I think we need poetry and fiction, and then there's more to engaging with reality than being a scientist in a white lab coat. But we need to be able to clearly distinguish fact from fantasy, or fact from merely fertile flights of the imagination. And we want to be rigorous there and rational there. And it's not that there's no place for mere creativity that's not on the rails of rationality.
He's like, yes, I have a method, but then we never hear about this method. I mean, he does at one point say something about looking for universal themes and disregarding the bits that are contradictory or whatever, but I don't really see him doing that in his method. Do you?
No, I don't. And when we were listening to the latest talks, you can see that Sam is always saying, yeah, I can see value in these stories. And, at no point does Sam say, no, we should just throw the Bible into the trash can, right? He acknowledges that, but I don't think Peterson does it the other way around. Peterson doesn't say, well, maybe Sam is right. Maybe, the free will problem, blah, blah, blah. He never sort of acknowledges the more scientific approach, although he proclaims to be a scientist as well, but I feel like he's lacking on that department as well. So I totally agree with you, yeah.
Sam is transpersonal. He can do the meditation and stuff like that, but he doesn't understand the poetry well, whereas Peterson understands the poetry, but he doesn't have any kind of a transpersonal interpretation of that poetry, which is pretty interesting. I say this because Mario says that Sam doesn't talk about consciousness, but Sam does talk about consciousness. He talks about Buddhism, and he even starts his morality with consciousness. He talks about consciousness in different language games.
So when Mario was criticizing Sam, that Sam doesn't bring enough value in terms of meaning of life or having some kind of an ethos driving your life. And one could argue that Sam is a little lackluster in this department. I could agree with that. But this is the interesting point that you brought up. So I agree more or less that Sam, like I said, doesn't bring a lot. But his view on consciousness is more precise than, and this is the problem you mentioned. So there's a difference between consciousness and the content of consciousness, right? And
right.
I didn't feel like Mario understands this distinction, although maybe he will correct me on that. But consciousness is not the same as its content. So what Jordan talks about is the structure of content that comes in consciousness and not consciousness itself. So consciousness is the only thing that doesn't seem to change from birth to death, but the content changes all the time when we go through the developmental changes. And this is basically the distinctions you're making. This is the difference between transpersonal person. So transpersonal person will understand, okay, I am a conscious being, and whatever appears in my consciousness is a content.
So I'm also saying that a transpersonal person is a person who's deconstructed their ego. For example, I know that David is just a story that I continue to perpetuate about my body as it moves through time. And we all play this game and we talk about things this way, but I know that that's just mythology, that's not the absolute truth of what I really am. And I could continue to play along with this story and continue to be who I am in the light of my past, or I could decide to change the story. Again, this gets into the problem of free will. Everything we know has been communicated to us. Even if we develop a meta perspective, it still is to some extent the same voice coming through the back door commenting on itself. But at least that gives you some kind of an ability to upgrade or to change. When you know it's just the story, it doesn't mean that you stop telling stories, but it does give you the ability to manipulate the story in different ways or to create new characters or whatever it is. And that, I think, is what it really means to be transpersonal.
And I feel like I don't see any deconstructivism in Peterson's words. I don't think he understands those. I don't know, it's weird, but...
He would not advocate for that.
And it's even questionable. Yeah, and it's even questionable whether he understands it. I would even put that under the question. But yeah, that's a problem. That's why I feel like somebody who's postmodernist and who to at least some extent realized his quote-unquote true nature, the idea that he's consciousness and there's a difference between who you feel you are. So basically Peterson is always working from the presupposition that you are you. You are the ego.
Right,
the person,
He never questions any of this. He never tries to deconstruct the self or anything.
It's actually objectively true to say then you are an illusion, right? Well, the only thing that's objectively true, and that's something that, Sam Harris argues, is that you are just consciousness and its thoughts. And that can be extremely liberating, not to all people. Obviously, maybe somebody who's at the blue level on Spiral, let's say, maybe such a thing would not be helpful at this point. So this is where Jordan is useful. But for somebody who's postmodernist, something like Jordan is saying might also not be as useful. And again, Jordan doesn't make those distinctions. So I don't see how Mario saw integration, because again, I feel like Jordan is extremely weak on this subject of free will and deconstructivism. That's my opinion.
And Sam is really strong on it. I mean, there's a couple things that Sam needs to learn. He could really learn from Peterson the relative nature of language and the ability to use symbol literacy a little bit more skillfully to realize that his objective maps, even though they're the most accurate maps, are not actually the territory. And he's hammering this point home pretty well, even though Sam is was like, no, look how well qualified my map is. But it's interesting because I still feel like, and Sam brings this up too, that Peterson definitely shows favoritism towards Christianity. And he wants to act like popularity equals the true or the good or the better or the best.
When Peterson speaks of pragmatism, I think his major point there was that if something is successful on a global scale, or if a tradition is successful on a mass scale, it is reasonable to assume that it has to teach you, at the very least, something about human subjectivity. Otherwise, it wouldn't have become so successful in the first place.
He's not doing this cross-cultural analysis, getting the universal ideas and their cultural costumes and kind of parsing these elements out and seeing what they both have to teach us, Joseph Campbell style. No, he's saying that there's sort of a marketplace of ideas, and the ones that come to the top are the best because they've been selected by this universal process. And again, this is where he might be confusing imposed dictator hierarchies with natural growth hierarchies, because a lot of these ideas like Christianity and stuff weren't spread because they were popular. They were spread by the sword. Mario says at one point that these ideas don't teach us about the world, but tell Jordan Peterson that, because he seems to be confused about some of this stuff.
So call Jordan Peterson and tell him that.
You call him, Mario.
Yeah, you call him, Mario.
Get him on the phone. Let's talk to him. That's kind of scary. I don't know if I want to talk to him.
I think it would be great.
He's like, David, let me see a picture of your room right now.
Yeah, that would be the first thing that would happen, yeah.
And I'd be like, all right. And I'd show him, he's like, see, you don't have any room to talk. Go clean your room. Wah, wah, wah. He beat me with his damn clean your room trump card.
You would be extremely unhappy, Lobster, that's for sure.
It's a deal breaker. Let's see your room. It's all cluttered with communist art or whatever. So we know that Peterson has no skillful integration method, right? And Sam kind of has a little bit of problem with this as well. I just want to reiterate this point that just because you're integrating in multiple things does not mean that you're integral. Ken Wilber loves to go around and tell people, if you're hearing the sound of my voice, that means that you are also integral. I feel like this is more of a sales tactic than the actual truth. I mean, it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I think there's tons of people in our community who say they're integral and don't know the theory. I mean, tons of them.
There's a lot of this greenish kind of wannabe integral, I guess, right?
Right. A lot of people are giving a lot of people the integral benefit of the doubt.
And you had a lot of fights with them on Facebook, or lots of debates, right? I mean, yeah, you're becoming quite a meme around those things.
I'm a meme?
You're becoming one, yeah.
I do have a couple memes.
Yeah, the orange material is David Long.
Hey, did you see that one really good Iams dog food one?
I know a few people memed you.
Go ahead and be memed to me. I like it.
You can meme David Long, by the way. Anybody who's listening to the podcast, try to meme him as much as you can. Should we go to the next one?
Yeah, let's move on.
So this is the fourth one.
Let me say, though, before we go on, that Mario's distinctions are integral. He clearly understands what's going around this. So, I mean, if his ultimate goal, going back to these ideas, is to get the ideas, his mission is accomplished.
Yeah.
He gets it.
Like I said, Mario has done some work. You know, he's driving a truck and talking to us. And I'm thinking to myself when I was listening to him, whatever this guy is doing in his life, he did some shit, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, he seems very well read. He seems to know what he's talking about on a lot of these subjects. I think we might have a little bit of disagreements around maybe free will and determinism.
This is something that Genetically Modified Skeptic pointed out. There's actually a video on Jordan Peterson. You know, Peterson claims he's so scientific, right? And I don't know if you've seen the video. There were like two snakes mating, and Peterson said that that's actually a representation of DNA.
On March 13th, 2017, Jordan Peterson uploaded the 8th part of his Maps of Meaning lecture series on his YouTube channel. Near the end, he begins talking about helical shapes as depicted in ancient artwork from all over the world, and it quickly gets interesting.
This is from China. So this is Fuxi and Nuwa. I think I've got that right. But I just love that representation. It's so insanely cool, this representation. So you see the sort of the primary mother and father of humanity emerging from this underlying snake-like entity with its tails tangled together. I think that's I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA. So, and that representation, that entwined double helix, that is everywhere. You can see it in Australian Aboriginal art, and I'm using the Australians as an example because they were isolated in Australia for like 50,000 years. They're the most archaic people that were ever discovered, and they have clear representations of these double helix structures in their art. So, and those are the two giant serpents out of which the world is made, roughly speaking. It's the same thing, you see that in the staff of Asclepius, which is the healing symbol that physicians use, although usually that's only one snake, but sometimes it's two.
Yeah, the claim seems pretty outlandish. It's just dropped in the lecture all of a sudden, and the context does little to explain what he means. And when I first heard this, I actually gave him the benefit of the doubt. I thought that he meant that in the modern day, we assign the same representative meaning to these works of art that we do to representations of DNA, or something along those lines at least. But as I researched further, I found out that wasn't the case. I found another clip of Peterson addressing this issue on his channel, this time in part 4 of his biblical series, posted on June 19, 2017. Now, we'll get to the DNA claim, but I've got to address the weirdness that precedes it.
Earlier you showed a picture of Fuxi and Nua.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and Osiris, and in your Maps of Meaning lectures, you also explained that cultures around the world have these twin snakes that are...
Yeah, they're everywhere, man.
Yeah, and so you mentioned that you believe this is a representation of DNA.
You would bring that up too. Jesus, what is it with you guys tonight? Yeah, well, yeah. No, I wouldn't say I believe that. I have my suspicions that that might be it. Yeah, because believe is too strong a word, but those representations are everywhere.
Did you notice the backpedaling there?
I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA. No, I wouldn't say I believe that. I have my suspicions that that might be it. Yeah, because believe is too strong a word, but those representations are everywhere.
I don't know, maybe he thought about it since and changed his mind a bit, or maybe when asked about it on the spot, he saw good reason not to hold closely to the claim. Once you hear his sources, I think you'll understand why he would do that.
But those representations are everywhere. And read this book. This is a good one.
Is it just me, or has anyone else had experiences with Jordan Peterson fans where someone who accepts one of Peterson's points is challenged or questioned, and they don't provide an explanation for themselves, but instead demand you read an entire book or watch an entire lecture series to even be able to begin to understand them? Is Peterson himself influencing them to do that? Look, I'm all for recommending resources in order to more fully explain one's beliefs, but if that's all you do when asked to explain one of your claims, I'll seriously question your credibility if you can't explain it, and your integrity if you just choose not to. These are some of the basics of being a good communicator and educator. Yes, some ideas are very complicated and take a while to explain well, but if you can't walk someone through it, you're not ready to communicate about it publicly. I honestly lean toward the idea that Peterson could explain this if he so chose, and I think the reason why he chose not to becomes clear upon examination of his sources.
Read this book. This is a good one. It's by an anthropologist who went down to the Amazon jungle and experimented intensively with ayahuasca. I think it's called The Cosmic Serpent. I think that's the name of the book. You could read that. There's another one called Breaking Open the Head, which is also pretty damn interesting. We don't know the limits of our perception, especially under certain conditions. And I think people have had intimations of DNA as the cosmic serpent forever.
Jesus Christ. So I took a look at the books Peterson mentioned, and it turns out that Cracking Open the Head is a journalist's ideas about consciousness-expanding substance use and modern shamanism, somewhat related to the topic at hand. The other book, The Cosmic Serpent, though, is where Peterson's claim definitely comes from. In the book, an anthropologist travels to Peru, does ayahuasca with the natives, and proposes the idea that thousands of years ago they took hallucinogenic drugs to tap into an innate knowledge of DNA seated deep within their brains. The Peruvian natives also still do this to obtain medical knowledge to use toward treating the sick. But has this method ever been tested, you ask? Has the process those natives use to acquire new knowledge been subjected to controlled and repeated experimentation? Well, no, but that's only because Western scientists don't take it seriously and are trying to suppress the truth about shamanic medicine so Big Pharma can keep stuffing their pockets. All of this is speculation in order to simply explain the fact that...
It's very strange that these double helixes exist in so many places and that they're often utilized as healing symbols. With the snake.
You know, come to think of it, does this remind you of any other fringe claims regarding ancient art and architecture? Evangelist Kent Hovind proposes that young Earth creationism is true and that dinosaurs once lived alongside man in order to explain dinosaurs depicted in supposedly ancient art. The meme Legends from Ancient Aliens propose that super technologically advanced extraterrestrials built the pyramids in order to explain the fact that pyramids have been found all over the world, and Jordan Peterson proposes that hallucinogenic drug trips allow people to tap into innate medical knowledge in their brains in order to explain the common appearance of snakes forming helical structures in ancient art. Meanwhile, in reality, the art Hovind is examining is fake, a pyramid is simply the best way to make a stable stack of rocks, and humans on every continent but Antarctica have witnessed snakes mating. These are all the same kind of unnecessarily complex and outlandish explanation for relatively simple phenomena.
That representation, that entwined double helix, that is everywhere. I really believe that's a representation of DNA.
Occam's razor, selecting the answer to a problem which makes the fewest assumptions, was completely ignored here. You'd think that with all of Peterson's education, he'd utilize that tool when it's appropriate, but I guess he chose not to. In doing so, he espoused some quantum healing Vedic spiritualist level woo. You just went full Deepak Chopra, Peterson. Never go full Deepak. Now that I know Peterson's propensity for pseudoscience, I think there's even more reason to be alarmed at his popularity. In my research, I found that wherever this topic was being discussed, his fans defended his stance with points like, you really need to read these books in their entirety to really understand this, and there really is something to this, although it's quite complicated to explain here. I'm honestly kind of freaked out about the level of parroting I'm seeing here. I'm not saying that this behavior is exclusive to Peterson fans, but wherever it exists, I think it needs to be challenged or else ridiculous ideas are allowed to propagate without ever being fact-checked.
So he was like almost saying, well, those old civilization actually knew about the DNA, as if they never saw two fucking snakes mating. And this is something I feel is dangerous. If Jordan really at some point thought that was a representation of DNA, that sort of, you start to think, does he know how to think critically? It wouldn't never occur to him that, maybe there actually are just two snakes mating. So that's another a red sign I would have toward Jordan.
Right. This all goes back to this idea around pre-trans distinctions. And Mario's basically always given Peterson the benefit of the doubt and saying that, he always is interpreting these things in a Jungian way.
I think it's pretty obvious. He uses all the major concepts in the Bible in metaphorical ways. And so with every major religious concept, it is conventionally being applied to the right quadrant, but Peterson applies every single concept to the left quadrant. This is why he makes the distinction between Jesus and Christ. Jesus is the particular body, the right quadrant. In Christ is Christ consciousness, which is in the left quadrant.
But we know this is wrong because we've seen the examples, right?
We're going to link to that video so Mario can check it out.
And there's also the other video, too, where they ask him if he believes in Jesus was resurrected literally.
And that one too,
he dances all around that question and says he can't answer it.
Quick question, are you a Christian?
I suppose the most straightforward answer to that is yes, although I think it's let's leave it at yes.
Well, I'm a bit dissatisfied with that because there are so many kinds of Christians, and I would never imagine that you were a very literal-minded Christian.
Well, there are truths other than the literal that perhaps are more truthful than even literal truth.
But do you believe that Jesus rose again from the dead? Literally.
I cannot answer that question, and the reason is because. Okay, let me think about it for a minute, see if I can come up with a reasonable answer to that. Well, the first answer would be, it depends on what you mean by Jesus.
A historical human being that existed
in a body.
In a body.
In a body. And it was a physical body, and then it was on Earth.
Yes, it was on Earth, and that was literally came back to life after death.
I would say that at the moment I'm agnostic about that issue, which is a lot different than saying I don't believe that it happened. One of the things I have come to learn over the last 15 years in particular is that the world is a very, very strange place. It's far stranger than we think. And what we don't understand about consciousness and its relationship with the body would fill many books. And you could say the same thing about our relationship with time, and perhaps corporality and vulnerability and death for that matter. I don't know what would happen if you got the balance between death and life exactly right.
I've never heard Peterson talk about the difference between Jesus and the Christ. He talks about this idea that in the beginning there was light, and light is consciousness. So it's like these are supposed to be trans-rational interpretations of Christianity. But I personally haven't seen him make these distinctions. And again, at the end of the day, I'm not sure that either one of these things are transpersonal, or it's great that he's got the construct awareness. But without being able to read the transpersonal aspects of some of this trans-rational poetry, it's like he's not really getting all of the value out of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The symbol of Jesus on the cross is a symbol of dying to your ego, which is not what Jordan Peterson is talking about. He's talking about the idea of self-sacrifice, but not in this way of die to your concept of self, but anyways, I digress. Did you have more to say about number 5?
No, I have nothing more to say. We can go to the next one, which is number 6.
This, by the way, makes Peterson much more similar to the atheists that he's so critical of than to the traditionally religious. He admits that you can't just focus on one specific holy scripture and rely that it's the best version, it's the only true version, but you have to look at all classical literature. I mean, Christ's sake, he's even interpreting Disney movies as classical literature. It's like, come on, man. He's really not focused on one specific tradition. Wherever he finds something that teaches us about human consciousness, he takes it up. Wherever he feels like something has become a classic, he takes it up and quotes it. He's really not someone who's focused on a specific holy scripture. So whenever he finds something popping up again and again in different disciplines, independently of each other.
You also explained that cultures around the world have these twin snakes that are...
Yeah, they're everywhere, man.
He thinks he has a reason to take it seriously. and to assume that there might be something to it. And whenever an interpretation cannot withstand the modern sciences, he's actually dropping it. So the idea of the Earth having been created in a few days, he of course rejects as absolutely absurd. Whatever kind of idea cannot withstand the modern day scientists is being dropped.
I would say that at the moment I'm agnostic about that issue, which is a lot different than saying I don't believe that it happened.
Peterson, the atheist.
Yes, Peterson's an atheist. That's exactly why he's saying that Sam Harris is a Christian, right? That's why he claims to be a Christian. I mean, he doesn't make metaphysical claims. He even says that he doesn't feel qualified to make metaphysical claims, which I've heard him say that. That sounds like he's closer to a hard agnostic. Maybe not a hard agnostic, maybe just like a soft and mushy agnostic where he's like, I don't know, I think it's probably God magic, but I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he's definitely mishmashy. He's not concrete.
Not sure.
Let's he's not sure. He's not concrete.
He thinks there must have been some magic in that old hat that they found.
That selective spirit of the Father has been part of the process that's generated our very being, and it's certainly possible that that collective spirit of the Father reflects something metaphysically fundamental about the structure of reality itself.
Wait, I was with you up until the last sentence, yes. Yeah.
You know, if you, look, let's go all cognitive neuroscience on this, shall we? 99% of your processing is unconscious. You're not capable of articulating yourselves. If you were, you'd be omniscient. Okay, but don't give me any nonsense about that.
But that is a... I've never heard so many people applaud an evasion of a simple question.
It was a good one.
Yeah. Okay, honestly, yes, everything you just said about not being fully transparent to yourself is true, and you are ruled by committee in there all the time, no doubt. But I'm asking what you actually believe. I mean, there's several things I can ask. I mean, almost any one of these threads can pull the whole tapestry. But to take Christianity as an example, what do you believe about the origin of this sacred book, the Bible, Old and New Testament? Do you believe that just maybe it has a status unlike any other book, or is it simply old writing of human beings just like ourselves?
I think it's both.
Okay, so but so what does that mean? You're saying that there's somebody who's taking dictation that is unlike any other dictation. So Homer, though creative, or Shakespeare, though creative, was doing something else.
Sources of inspiration.
Okay, but everyone's been inspired.
If you talk to creative people,
yes,
they often describe themselves as something approximating a conduit through which higher wisdom is pouring.
Again, you're dodging. Shakespeare could say that, and any writer can say that ultimately, right?
And it's also the case that we would rank order those writers, which is why you pointed to Shakespeare, in terms of the generalizable validity of their revelations.
Sure.
And so, well, look, so you run into the same issue. You criticize the Bible, and look, fair enough. But you're also evading a very important issue, which is how do you quantitatively rank the contributions of literature without assuming that there's a hierarchy of revelation?
There's a hierarchy of wisdom. Sure, there's a hierarchy of human wisdom. I will grant you that every day of the week. But but we're talking about primates like ourselves having conversations, and this is the most important game we can play. I mean, this is the best game in town, and it has always been so. One thing we know is that when you read the Bible, you can turn every page of that book, and you will not find evidence of omniscience. You will not find anything in there that someone as smart as Shakespeare, or actually a little bit dumber, could have written.
No, I don't think that's true, Sam. There are incredibly whatever else you might say about the biblical writings, there are incredibly potent narratives embedded within them. It's impossible to write something, virtually impossible to write something like Cain and Abel. It's a paragraph long.
You're saying the Shakespeare of 3,000 years ago couldn't have written Genesis?
He couldn't have written Cain and Abel, not in 10 sentences.
So then
Cain and Abel is 10 sentences long. So then it contains more wisdom than you can dig out in a lifetime.
But now we're getting to the nub of it. Then you think that was not the product of a human mind?
I think it was the product of a vast collection of human minds working over millennia.
Okay, so we have a committee of Shakespeare's. But still, we're just dealing with people. We've just got people. But this concession, if indeed you're making it, and I'm still not sure, is the eradication of traditional Christianity.
If something is deeply wise, it's reflective of a deeper reality. Otherwise, it wouldn't be wise.
I'm in love with deeper reality.
So what's the deeper reality that something as wise as the story of Cain and Abel reflects? What's the reality?
A landscape of mind that that either takes great training, great luck, or pharmacological bombardment of the human brain to explore.
Do you think there's still some kind of metaphysical good stuff in Christianity? Maybe God is some kind of metaphysical reality beyond just this sorting principle that allows hierarchy to happen?
I don't really see Jordan dropping all the things that are not compatible with modern science.
No.
If you would just compare, let's say, Joseph Campbell and Jordan Peterson, there's just no debate. You can clearly see and hear Joseph Campbell make these distinctions, if we want to compare the two.
Right. I mean,
and I don't see Jordan doing that. So again, I don't see it. Sorry.
Sam keeps on bringing up this idea that he's worried because scripture is infallible, right? And Peterson's willing to admit that it might have some issues or some of it might be out of date, but he also wants to say that it's like meta truth, like ultimate absolute realization or crystallization of the truth of the cosmos. Better than facts, better than valid theories. It's like archetypal meta truth.
There are truths other than the literal that perhaps are more truthful than even literal truth.
And again, it doesn't flow in the real world, unfortunately. It's useful for subjective objective world for sure, but again, we gotta teach people to make those distinctions. So you have Christian fundamentalists who will take Jordan literally because he's not making those distinctions.
Have you ever heard Peterson say that there are universal aspects to an archetype, cultural aspects to an archetype, and personal inflections of an archetype? Like the mother archetype, for example, right? That's a universal, but at the same time, it'll have a particular cultural variation that's personal to the person who's talking about it or whatever, and it'll have a personal variation that's related to your personal experience of mother. Right?
I never heard him make that distinction.
No, but that would be super useful, wouldn't it?
That would be nice to point out, yeah.
There's so many good distinctions like this that he could be making, but he just never makes any distinctions. He just speaks about it in such a very vague way. It's super frustrating. But let's go back to the idea that he's an atheist. Just because he's not playing the fundamentalist game, the way that he uses the word metaphysical gives you a clue as to how he means it. He uses it in a mystical kind of way, not in a philosophical kind of way.
That selective spirit of the Father has been part of the process that's generated our very being, and it's certainly possible that that collective spirit of the Father reflects something metaphysically fundamental about the structure of reality itself.
Wait.
When you're trained to know the difference, you can hear it in the way a person uses the word. Jordan Peterson does think that Christianity is the best, and he doesn't really do comparative mythology and talk about classic literature. I mean, a little bit like Disney stories and stuff, but you don't really ever hear him talk about Buddhism or Hinduism or really incorporate any kind of realizations like this from other traditions. He's not talking about overarching themes that appear in mythology or anything like that.
Yeah, he doesn't seem, he's obviously a huge, let's say, Christian dick rider, but the other religions, he mentions them, but he never seems to go in any kind of detail. He's definitely lacking on that area as well. He doesn't seem to understand Buddhism at all. Even Sam Harris pointed out at him that the idea of evil is different in Buddhism than it is in Christianity.
Again, this has been focused through the lens of your attachment to Christianity, largely. Yeah. But Hinduism is a completely different set of stories. Many of them have the opposite valence from any Christian story you would tell. Good and evil do not have the same meaning in the East. Evil is just ignorance on some level.
You haven't met any real evil people if you believe that.
Well, okay, so then all the Hindus and Buddhists are wrong about this. That's a possible claim. I'm just saying that there's over 1 billion people who have a religious system of stories from which they derive all kinds of meaning, to which they're mightily attached, to where we could play the same game of archetypal interpretation and valuing, and yet the cash value with respect to good and evil is irreconcilable with what you get from Christianity.
But it doesn't have to be interoperable, right?
Presumably, Hinduism is also useful as a set of heuristics for Hindus. If Hinduism and Christianity are irreconcilable, right, then there must be a deeper level of reality that explains why they both work. That can't be reducible to Christianity being true or Hinduism being true.
Obviously, I'm not comparative mythologist, but Sam said that evil in Buddhism is more about ignorance to the truth, while evil in Christianity is more about not abiding to the moral code.
Against God's opinion.
Yeah, exactly. So you already have two basic variations of evil that Jordan just doesn't seem to bring to the table, which he should probably, if he wants to be like this comparative mythologist and try to take the best stories from all the religions. He just seems to be more like a Christian dick rider in this case.
Right. And maybe this is also why Mario thinks that Jordan Peterson is integral, is because to some extent this is kind of what Wilbur does too, right? He cherry picks the data to create the story and the map.
Wilbur does the exactly opposite. He brings Buddhist ideas to Christian.
Right. He tries to act like Christianity is actually saying just Buddhism.
Yeah, exactly. So Wilbur is doing the other way. He's projecting Buddhism to all the other religions, while Jordan is just more like, obviously he thinks that Christianity is the main one. He doesn't necessarily project Christianity to other religions, but he's acting like Christianity is the main one and the other ones are like, well, they're not so important. Something like that.
Right.
Interesting kind of thing. Yeah.
And so Mario is saying that when an idea disagrees with science, he rejects it. I don't know if that's the case.
Well, again, we have the Jesus thing, we have the DNA thing, the snakes. Again, he has some pre-trans fallacies. I mean, there are signs, man. Again, not integral. He doesn't seem to be quite scientifically as literate as he's proclaiming to be.
Right. I think there's one point in this thing where Mario says there's no systemic way to tell these things.
The issue here is that there is no systematic way of finding out what is true and what is not, which are real truths about consciousness and which are not, because we can't approach it as we approach third-person objects.
And I want to say, yes, there is. There's integral methodological pluralism. There's integral epistemology. I have a video about this. We're clearly making these distinctions. Don't well, Mario.
Sorry.
Okay, that's not. He forgives you.
Yeah, go check David's video. What's the name?
It's called Different Types of Truth, Integral Epistemology.
Yeah. Go check that video out. It's great.
Thanks, bud. Let's go to the next one, the Naturalistic Fallacy.
I didn't feel like any of them made naturalistic fallacies. We can use the science or worst possible misery as a cornerstone for morality and ethics. So I agree on him on that point.
Yeah, he was actually, I really like this analogy he made about rules of a game, right? So it's like, he said that you can get a should from an is in the context of a game.
Social contexts themselves define the very meaning of the word ought. So if in the context of a soccer game, you commit a rule violation, within that specific social context, you ought to leave the field. In this context, when you know something about first-person facts, so when you know what will lead to the worst possible misery, you can immediately deduce what you ought to do and what you ought not to do.
And culture is a game. We're constantly living inside of these language games where it's like, if you're playing this game where words mean shit, right? If good means anything, if bad means anything. So that's what Sam Harris is talking about, right? So yeah, that's
I have nothing more to say.
Yeah, let's move on to number 8.
Yeah, this one is a bit more triggering for me. Why is Peterson against basic income?
Yes, this one is triggering, but it also has nothing to do with our talk. Something to keep in mind. Let's go ahead and go into it. Let's keep in mind that this really has nothing to do with our talk. This is just some extra bonus.
I think basic income is definitely a topic we could touch.
We should,
just
at
you
some
and me. I think it's an important topic to talk about. But again, I feel like Mario and the same thing with Peterson is this old school neoclassical economist theory. Like the idea that you gotta work hard.
Yeah.
The fear and greed, that greed makes the world go around and all the stuff.
Or like this idea that if people don't have incentive to work, they'll just sit around to do nothing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, all those are just theories that were created, like, I don't know, in 1700s or
and
whatever.
It's interesting because they're like contradicting themselves. They're saying things like, let's just leave the market to itself, but then they also want to shut down criticism and progress. It's like, you won't let the thing do its thing to refine itself, but yet you want to act like you want this open system.
I think Mario was saying that we don't know what basic income would do on a large scale, which I agree, and I'm not saying everybody should get it. There's not like a black and white kind of solution. I'm not going to say a lot about it, but I'll say this, that when we talk about basic income, obviously there are some standards that we need to have. Like, for instance, okay, here's your income. Let's say we have somebody who's homeless or who cannot get a job for whatever reason. We can say, here is your basic income, but you can spend only money on this and that. So you can only spend money for bettering yourself. So I would agree that if we just give basic income to anybody with no repercussions, obviously that's a stupid idea. If you give basic income to a homeless drunk guy, well, he's just gonna buy more fucking alcohol and be homeless and drunk. So obviously there's no incentive there. So it's not black and white. So you want to give basic income, but you gotta have some standards here.
He's also saying in this thing that somewhere Jordan Peterson gives integral solutions or makes integral distinctions about this, but I don't see him doing that. I see him talking about upper left quadrant reductionism, just like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's the same theme of saying that you want the future, but shutting down the steps to get there.
And he makes false assumptions. And I feel like I assume Mario is doing the same thing. It's like the idea that making money will make you do things, and people need that kind of, like you said, initiative to do something. Obviously, that's false. You have people who do a lot of things without money at all. So
right. I mean, look at me. I'm doing all kinds of things and just giving them away for free.
Yeah.
Where's my money?
I'm actually
going out of pocket and spending all my free time on this. If I was just driven by monetary incentives, I'm a fucking failure.
And also this idea that if you work hard, you're going to be successful. Again, I don't know whether Jordan or Mario can see it, but that's just a capitalistic propaganda. So people think they have freedom to succeed. Now, I'm not saying, obviously there are people who focus their life and actually do succeed because of their hard work, but that's far in between. Most of your success is not about you achieving your goals. I mean, why aren't you a millionaire, Mario? Why are you driving a truck? Well, there's a reason you're driving a truck, and the reason is because you're in a capitalistic system that doesn't want you to succeed.
If it was every person to their highest potential, if they had any ability to recognize your cognitive ability, Mario, if they had any way of actually valuing you and really realizing how fucking smart you are, man, they would not let you drive a truck. They would be like, Mario, no, please, man, come and help us work on these problems because you're way too smart to be driving a truck. Now, I'm sorry, Mario, if I'm calling you out on your job, I'm doing shitty jobs too. And I feel this as well. I feel undervalued and underappreciated by capitalism, where it's just like, fuck you, Mario, fight for it. Prove it, Mario, fight for it, man. Like, you know what I mean? If you think that this is a value, you think you're of worth, prove it with no help, you know what I mean? And we'll kick you while you're down and stuff like that. This is not a system that's built to help everyone thrive. Like, I think this is very triggering, right? This whole thing. The greatest exploited resource or missed out resource is the potential of humans. You know, there are so many people who could be like the next Einstein. Einstein, or be like the next huge, smart, great athlete or painter or whatever it is, filmmaker, and we miss out on all that because we're making everybody fight for it instead of constantly be giving people boosts and challenge and encouragement. That's what we need to do, which is not the same as Marxism by any means, but we're going to have to get to this point where everybody's basic needs will be given to them, and there'll have to be some other reason why they achieve beyond just financial incentive. Like personal mastery, that will be the main reason that people want to go after this stuff. They want to improve themselves and be great. And
again, yeah, we gotta have this basic idea of what are facts and what are fiction. So it's a fiction, then you can be successful, that everybody can succeed, that we are all equal in terms of free market. And there's a lot of other problems with capitalism, like destroying the earth for the sake of money. Obviously, that needs to change the whole idea of you buying some resources that shouldn't really be destroyed, like, I don't know, Brazilian rainforest. But fuck it, if people want furniture, who gives a shit, right? We gotta stop with this capitalistic spending economy. So there's a lot of problems with our system. And again, free market is not gonna fucking save it. We're gonna have to go beyond that. And this is, again, something that postmodernists are right to complain about.
Absolutely. And Jordan Peterson, honestly, he doesn't want the kind of future that we're talking about. He wants a healthier version of past systems. He's stuck in the past. He doesn't really want this future that we're talking about.
He still has this idealistic idea of we can make some kind of green capitalism. Well, not necessarily, because if capitalism is all about making money and not actually saving the planet and the mankind, it's not going to work. As long as we have any kind of economy that's living itself on consumption, you're not going to have a healthy future. You're not going to have a future. And again, 5-year-old can understand that. And I haven't heard Jordan even mention that. Right? He cannot see beyond capitalism. And there are many other problems with capitalism. And I mean, even Russell Brand saw the problem with this. Consumerism is a problem. And you might say, well, making money gives people incentive. Sure, we can argue this, but it also gives incentive to destroy nature for the sake of profit. So there are problems,
And this goes really well into the next, where he asks me about integrating green.
You guys criticize Peterson for not being able to integrate postmodernism, and for being afraid of it. I don't know what you're basing this on exactly. Could you give me like one specific example, what he's not specifically able to integrate?
Can you give examples of bad integration of green? Well, let's give a few. That's one, right? He doesn't seem to be worried about environmentalism. That's a pretty big problem. We've already mentioned the fact that he doesn't have this transpersonal deconstruction of the ego. Right?
And also doesn't have the deconstruction of the freaking capitalism also.
Right? Again, he doesn't seem to value the communal themes, right? He's all about personal freedoms and stuff like that, right? Still.
Another thing, hierarchies don't always mean competence. There's also this false assumption that the higher you are on the hierarchy, or corporal hierarchy, or whatever kind of hierarchy, doesn't necessarily mean that you're the most competent person.
This seems to be like how he gets into the naturalistic fallacy himself and kind of stuck back at blue. And I mean, it really does seem like a lot of what he's doing is kind of like fetishizing this one particular level of expression of the unfolding of development, where he's just like, ooh, this one crystallization in our one culture, that's really the best stuff. So in that regard, that's not a good integration of green. That's kind of not really good relativism, not really good integration. And it's not integral integration. It's like picking and choosing from a Christian perspective. Like think about these Christians who are like, oh, I'm Christian, I go to church. And yeah, our worship leader is a lesbian and her girlfriend get up on stage and we have a lady preacher. It's like, okay, that's great that you're integrating in all of these postmodern values, but you're clearly picking and choosing what you want to believe from the text, and you're ignoring all places where it's kind of blatantly contradicting the ways that you're doing things. I mean, I do think we should want progress in our traditions, but at the same time, we need to really be honest about the negative parts of our traditions.
I totally agree, and that counts for both our religious traditions and also our economic, capitalistic traditions.
Exactly.
And again, they all had value at their time. I'm not like super anti-capitalist, but again, we live in 2018 and not in 1700s when there was like industrial revolution or whatever, right?
Right. It was good for a time, just like the traditional sages were good for a time, but now they're outdated. And
this neoclassical economic theory is Jesus Christ. I mean, these are outdated theories. They don't work in real world, but they were useful rules back then for sure. I don't disagree with that. But today we live in information age. People are getting educated. They can see that those ideas are basically BS at this point. Because I feel Jordan doesn't seem to understand that. His head is still in this classical economistic system.
His reaction to postmodernism, in part, by the way, I think is so harsh because postmodernism is not postmodern. And this is something that integral theory has not been dealing enough with. There is something like a regressive green or the regressive left. The issue is that Peterson is largely regarding postmodernism as a movement that is not truly post-formal and post-rational. In his interpretation, postmodernism is largely a pre-conventional thought system that is using terms that are conveying to be post-conventional. In other words, the students that are immediately surrounding him and the academics that are surrounding him, I think he sees as largely having pre-rational thought systems, that they live through a post-formal conceptual scheme. Postmodernism is a conceptual system and is a language game. It's available to everyone. Everyone can learn to use the language game correctly. And this is what students do, by the way. They learn when it's appropriate to say what, using the postmodern conceptual language game. But this doesn't mean that they necessarily understand it. I mean, it's absurd to have students who have been studying postmodernism for 2 weeks and insist they are postmodern already. I think it really takes a lot of time. It's important to think whether postmodernism is a phenomenon, is a truly green phenomenon, or whether it's not largely motivated by anger and largely pre-rational motives.
I have a video called Spiral Dynamics Debunks Spiritual Singularity, which is exactly about this same point.
It's like a form of this regressive left where Jordan Peterson, he's a part of it, but he's also part of the green left, but he's also a critic of it. He's speaking a lot of green language, but it does seem to be from blue. These appeals to responsibility, this kind of socially conservative position.
He's an interesting mix, let's just put it that way.
There's an issue with lumping and not really being able to separate the baby from the bathwater. There's some real poor integration that's happening around there.
Yeah, you're gonna have to point us out if Mario did this video, right? Again, you gotta point us out to the situations where Peterson clearly makes these distinctions because we don't hear them.
Right. I mean, I can definitely point you to places where Sam Harris is making integral distinctions, and we can link you to places where he's clearly failing to make these distinctions.
So if you can, present us with counterlinks, we'll see, right? But I doubt you will.
So number 10, don't lie. Integrity as intellectual honesty. But Jordan Peterson does have these problems where he doesn't make clear distinctions, and he argues in a very weaselly way with definitions, and he seems to play these kinds of games and give really vague examples.
I would say sentence by sentence, yes, you're correct. Paragraph by paragraph, perhaps. By the way, in case you think that I'm weaseling around here, and I'm not, is that's exactly what you do every time you read any story, any work of fiction. You say, well, you're not claiming that the Bible is a work of fiction. It's like, that's just a cheap objection. That's not my point. My point is that it's a narrative. Like if you're a screenwriter, for example, there's an old dictum that if there's a rifle lying on a table in the first scene, that it better be used by the end of the second scene or it shouldn't have been there at all. So there's this coherence.
I'm looking for the rifle in your answer to this question,
yeah,
though, I want it to be used. You're making this harder than it is, and my concern is why. Right?
Well, I don't think I am, Sam, because I think that the fundamental message in the New Testament, for example, is that
so each individual... The Old Testament, so Jews are in possession of a book that has some diabolical passages that would be better left out.
So even though he talks about integrity and intellectual honesty, it seems like maybe he's not as honest with himself. But I do feel like he's won some more intellectual honesty points since I've seen his newer talks with Sam Harris, where he starts out steelmanning, and it really does seem like he's genuinely trying to get and give upgrades. And so, again, maybe this is a place where Mario hears you and me saying, laughing about how Peterson has a problem being honest, right? And then he sees these debates with Sam Harris, and he's like, God damn, Peterson is a great example of how to have an honest conversation with somebody in these cases, right? So I don't know. I feel a little bit torn personally around that now after seeing both of these different extremes. What do you think?
I have nothing to say. Let's go on the next one.
Okay. You have nothing to say about that?
I have nothing to say. No.
So you don't think that Peterson's kind of weaselly?
No, I do agree on that. No, when I say I have nothing to say, it doesn't mean I don't agree with you. I was more like in terms of, yeah, I agree, but I don't have anything more to say.
You agree, but you don't know if there's anything. So yeah, it's weird. He's weaselly, but at the same time, he does seem like he's trying to be honest sometimes. In general.
It's so weird because he can't, when you hear him speak, he seems honest, right? I can't deny the fact he seems extremely sincere. But the feeling is he comes off sincere, but when you start to listening to his words, the way when people try to pin him down, he becomes weaselly really fast and he distorts words, or maybe he oversimplifies things so you can interpret it your own way. He's definitely weaselly, and this is where it proves to me that he doesn't make those integral distinctions.
Doesn't make them.
I'm testing different ways to, expanding my vocabulary in terms of sounding.
Your sound vocabulary?
Yeah, something like that.
Number 11 is about incremental changes to the system.
This is a point he's making again and again, that it's much easier to break something, that it's actually a miracle. All of this is working. All of these quadrants are actually fitting so well together, and it's much more likely that we break something than we're fixing something. Of course, change and adapt society stepwise.
And I'm saying that I think that this point contradicts his point number 8.
You can't both advocate for incremental change and also shut down the change agents when they want to speak out against stuff. You can't have it both ways.
So again, we've already touched on this point and how there's not really 4-quadrant solutions. I think that Mario on number 12 has good ideas and good distinctions and is better spoken on it than Jordan Peterson could ever hope to be, which is a theme in this. Mario's doing some Jordan Peterson apologetics.
No, I think that's a good way to put it. You're actually, like I said, you're overselling Jordan. You should actually be selling yourself more, to be honest, because you make more clear distinctions than Jordan does.
You cannot simply think your identity into existence. You have to act your identity into existence. You cannot simply think your identity into existence. You have to act your identity into existence. You cannot simply think your identity. You have to act. This is something that other people owe you respect for the activities that you have chosen, the agency that you have enacted in your own life. Other people, rightfully so, respect you. It's one thing to respect someone. It's another thing to recognize someone as a subject and grant him basic compassion. Everyone deserves compassion, as if everyone deserves to be recognized as a subject. But not everyone is equally deserving of your respect. Not everyone is equally deserving of your respect. Your respect.
So I have some notes here about identity and respect. I really like that, the idea that you shouldn't just get respect for your identity just because you have it, right? But this is also probably part of the process of refining your identity over time, right? Like dealing with input and changing it. You don't just craft your identity and be like, no, other people just don't understand my vision. Maybe you are like that a little bit, but
I mean, it's got to be probably this balance between being yourself, do you, but also try to work within a system even if you don't necessarily agree with it.
You do you, only you make you. You do you, only you make you. You do you, only you make you. Only you do you, you make you. You make you.
And then there's like personal versus legislation. So it's like, on one hand, you might decide that you want to do something, but that doesn't mean that we need to make laws about it.
Yeah, unless maybe the laws are preventing you, the existing laws, right?
Right.
But
right.
it depends on the subject and many other things.
But, those two things get a little bit conflated. What we personally subjectively like or think a person should be able to do or want to versus what we think should legally be allowed. And I think a lot of times those ideas get conflated. And, I'm still not sure whether Jordan Peterson understands the difference between sex and gender. But anyway, should we move on?
Number 13?
Yeah, so number 13 is about reading, right?
Peterson doesn't want you to read. Basically, Mario said that there are like these Peterson groups, like Facebook groups, which I never heard about them. And I'm sure Mario will show us the group. But the idea is they're all like studying the classics and all the books, and not just the classics, but Jordan Peterson in depth to really, really try to understand him.
When students ask him how to go forth if they want to develop themselves, he usually gives the answer that you have to read the classics. You have to set up a foundation. And this is also what you can observe when you look at the commentaries and the study groups that have been building around Jordan Peterson. He's the first public intellectual I'm aware of to have such a huge number of followers who are not just repeating whatever he's saying, but who are discussing the literature he's citing. They're picking up the books and they're reading the sources and discussing the sources. I've never seen anything like it before.
But what I'm arguing here is that there's danger of circle jerking, which I would say is that you can go and read all the classics and you can just read too far, and at some point it just becomes mental masturbation without any kind of distinctions. I think this is probably something that is happening in Joseph Campbell groups as well, at least the green ones. So they're reading Joseph Campbell, they try to go into details, but they don't make any basic distinctions. They're just circle jerking around some idealistic ideas. And I feel like if such groups really do exist, the same thing is going to happen because those people are not integral and they're not going to make integral distinctions. And also I never felt like if Jordan read all the classics, I obviously didn't, but if Jordan did, I never seen that really help him at all. Like, okay, he read the Dostoevsky. Well, how the fuck did that help him? He knows the stories, and obviously there are useful things in those stories, but did that really help him in debates or whatever? No, probably did not. So I have nothing against reading all the classics and trying to understand things in detail to some extent, but I do also think that you can go too far with it and just circle jerk the ideas, because it's not about understanding all the details, it's about putting those details in the right concept. And if you don't have the operating system to do that, that's not gonna help. And again, you have all these Jordan Peterson fans who obviously don't have that operating system. So even if those Jordan Peterson's groups do exist, I have huge doubts they will come up with something useful that was not already discovered.
Yeah, I'm personally in a bunch of Jordan Peterson groups because these Jordan Peterson videos are frankly some of my most popular. And so I want to be able to upload them in the group, post them in the group. And my experience of these Jordan Peterson groups is, for the most part, these are not like intelligent, well-spoken places of study and rigorous conversation. The Sam Harris groups are way better, in my opinion. I think integral groups are better still. but there's also a little bit of this like trolly shit talky stuff in all of these groups a little bit. I mean, there's gradations of it.
Yeah, and also we had like this one comment when we did the Jordan Peterson podcast. Some guy said that we are just whining, and then when you said, "Well, can you give us specific examples? Where are we whining and stuff?" He never really replied back. I'm not saying all Jordan Peterson fans are like that, but it's just an example, I guess.
Yes, some of the Peterson fans are some of the worst commenters. I post a lot of videos in a lot of places, and it's really mostly amongst the Jordan Peterson fanboys. You get some of the most immature type.
When I saw, for instance, video of Genetically Modified Skeptic or I think Amazing Atheist, when he was criticizing Jordan Peterson, a lot of dislikes usually for those because, you know, Jordan has his fanboys and they just dislike. And Amazing Atheist said, like, if you don't agree with me, engage me. Why don't you agree with what I'm saying in terms of criticizing Jordan? And when you go into details, obviously nobody knows what the fuck. It's impossible to have an argument with Jordan Peterson fan because I understand why. The problem is the Jordan himself is quite muddled. A lot of things he say have multiple meanings. He's using simplistic words that can be interpreted in any each way. So it's really hard to defend Jordan in general. Even I would probably have a hard time defending him, but even I would probably do a better job than most of Jordan Peterson fans because I have distinctions in my head and I understand where Jordan is coming from. Even though I see his faults, I would probably even do a better job defending him than most people who are his fans would.
Well, yeah, because they're arguing like assholes, basically, and you would never stoop to that kind of level of arguing.
Clean your room, bucko. Jordan is way above you, so shut the fuck up and quit whining. You're just another stupid postmodernist.
Yeah, good one, Snowflake. Those are the kind of comments that you get. You know, this all came up because I said something about how Jordan Peterson wouldn't want you to read Nietzsche. I was just saying that I didn't think that Peterson would really advocate for a Nietzschean type of perspective. Like, he obviously has disagreements with Nietzsche. All I was saying is that Nietzsche is not going to be at the top of Peterson's reading list. Now, even me, if I'm talking to you, it'd be nice if you'd read the Bible and know it pretty fluently. It'd be nice if you knew people like Ayn Rand and stuff like that, so I could reference them and whatnot. You know, of course, I want you to have read them and to study the classics and to know about literature, but that doesn't mean that those are books that I would be like, read this, you know? So that's all I was saying. So this next one is about free will.
You have noticed that free will is an intrinsic part of integral theory, right? You have noticed that free will is simply termed agency in integral theory, and it exists all the way down. How it's on a theoretical level possible to at the same time hold the notion of free will and hold the notion of science, which assumes determinism? Well, integral theory doesn't believe in determinism. In integral theory, nothing is determined, but determinism is a perspective on reality. Determinism is a perspective that we're applying on objects. Whenever I'm in touch with an object as such, there never is matter as such. There is nothing that is just an atom and nothing else. Atoms are constants. This gives integral theory sort of an idealist bent, but it is also what makes science possible and doesn't fall into a very incoherent version of materialism, which can't even reflect upon itself as a theory. And integral theory believes that it can still retain at the same time what we have so far been doing as science, but we have to reinterpret what science has been doing.
And I don't know if you've seen it or not, but I actually have a video about semantic compatibilism where I talk about this position of compatibilism between free will and determinism, which I would say is like probably the integral way of dealing with this problem. And the difference here is that we wouldn't talk about something like free will. We would talk about conditioned will, conditioned by nature and nurture. There's nothing happening that's not influenced by nature or nurture. So like the idea behind semantic compatibilism is basically that there are first and second person ways of talking about things, which is the way we normally talk. I want to go to the store. Do you want to come with me? And then there's third person descriptions of things like, well, the reason this is because of this and this and this and this. And even though compatibilism is a way of talking about this middle position between free will and determinism, in this case I'm saying, and the semantic compatibilism is the type of compatibilism that it's around the semantics that this type of compatibilism takes place. Both versions of the semantics are true. First person and second person ways of talking about things are true, and third person ways of talking about things are true. Unfortunately, it's a little bit confusing because the first and second person languages that we use and the third person languages we use are not necessarily compatible with each other. But yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion, you know, and a lot of people who believe in free will have this idealistic perspective, and Aljoša and I have a more emergentist perspective. So we don't think consciousness goes all the way down and back. We don't think God gave us free will. We don't think like free will is like this inherent quality of a soul or something like that. We believe in nature and nurture, right?
I think this is more or less the problem that we already tackled before. So at transpersonal levels, you sort of understand that the idea of realm of possibility is something that Mario was talking about, that you can like, there's no such thing as realm of possibilities. That's of course an illusion. What I am seeing or hearing from Mario is that he's basically confusing an abstract idea to what's actually true. And again, the abstract idea of free will is useful, but it's not true. So it's debatable whether both ideas are really are compatible if we are interested in what is true, but
right. Well,
that's all we have.
If you're saying if you're interested in what is true, that's like saying, I'm assuming that you mean objectively true.
Yeah.
So that's going back to like a third person kind of thing. It's like, well, if you want to know what's so, yeah, I mean, and this is where we agree in what you're trying to say is that there is no free will. What's actually true is determinism. But the way that we're talking about it is true given the kind of word games that we're playing with each other, right? So this goes back to what we were saying, where you can't get ought from an is or whatever, something like that.
I would actually switch that from, maybe it would be better to say it's useful but not necessarily true.
Well, no,
I think this is where I would put in usefulness instead of truth, maybe.
Well, it's
right?
like
it's useful to think of yourself as an agent going to the store, but it's not true. You know what I mean? Objectively.
Well, I'm saying it's true subjectively. When I say I want to go to the store, that's me truthfully reporting my desire, right? So that's true. It's just
okay
not
from that perspective. Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I understand what you mean. Yeah. Okay. If you put it in that way, yeah. Okay. That we can agree on that.
Yeah. So that's a pretty important distinction. So we do agree. I think that is what we're saying. This is also the problem when we talk about free will and determinism. It's like, okay, well, if everything's determined, then how can you ask a person to be good? And this is where we talk about this idea of a heavily conditioned will, right? If you don't have the conditioning, or you're not biologically fit or whatever, right, to be good, you can't be good, right? So we have to have these kinds of systems in place, and they come in both hardwired from nature, our natural repulsion to things and empathy and stuff like that, and as well as conditioning from the top down, being like, no, don't do that. You need to be a responsible agent, right? This kind of idea that like, yeah, I guess I need to be responsible. I mean, like that's a useful, like you're saying, piece of software to have in your head.
I agree that Jordan is strong in terms of giving agents these useful ideas, but we gotta, like you said, we gotta have those scientific truth take into account as well. Not just like, I don't know why people have such a hard time understanding this. Even though everything is determined, what ideas, when you're born, whatever ideas you are being,
everything we know has been communicated to us.
Yeah, and it's still important. All the ideas that people are exposed to are important whether we believe in free will or not.
Right.
That's the important part. Is I feel like people have hard time understanding. If there's no free will, then everything is just not important. No, it's even more important because we don't have free will. So, yeah, I don't know. I just feel like, again, Jordan doesn't really understand that we don't have free will. I think he actually literally believes we have it as an objective truth.
I think Mario believes in free will and might be a little bit idealistic too. I think if there are places where I disagree with Mario, it'd probably be around these ideas.
I feel like Mario has more idealistic view. I remember with him saying that, well, in integral theory, on the left side you have agency, and on the right side you have communion. Therefore, integral theory has a place for free will and looks at people as agents. And that's true. Integral theory does have agents in the theory, but that doesn't mean they're objectively true, nor does it mean, like you were saying at the beginning, like this idea of consciousness all the way down, like the...
And this idea of the tetra arising is built into the theory, and it's like he's appealing to that, right, as a bit of authority, like, hey, your integral, it's built into the theory, look.
So this is the problem with idealistic interpretation and the idea that atoms have this rudimentary form of consciousness, and therefore atoms have agency. Well, we know for a fact that's not the case.
Right.
Again, agency is a useful concept, and we talk as if we are all agents. I'm talking to you as if you are agent, and you're talking to me, and we're talking to Mario, but the fact of the matter or objective truth is we are just, a system.
Yeah.
There's no agency. There's only communion, if you will, or there's only system. There's only connectivity.
And it's like interesting. You could maybe like start to try to think about where does the free will or where does the agency come online? Earlier we were talking about getting to this point of existential awakening, right? Where you deconstruct the self. They're trying to put agency down, like it comes online. Well, they want to say it goes all the way down and back, like to even before the Big Bang, like agency.
Well, otherwise
is primary,
they're fucked, right? But you don't have any other choices. So if there's no other way you can do it. You can either say it goes all the way down or you're fucked.
Right. Well, I mean, that's kind of what I'm saying is like, even if we're going to say that it comes online at something like green at like a postmodern level, well, it's just the same heavily conditioned voice coming through the back door. Like I was saying earlier, you're still viewing the self within the context of the self. So there's no view from nowhere. There's no getting outside of nature or nurture or some extra thing or something like that. There's no free will, and idealism are pretty much a no-go.
Again, there's also this idea that people think that's a bad thing, right? But remember when you were saying like Neil deGrasse, when you posted that rap song.
We're all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically.
I think nature's imagination is so much greater than man's. He's never gonna let us relax. cosmos is also within us. We're made of spark stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
We are all interconnected, right? We are made from the atoms that made the universe. We
Yeah,
are breathing
it's
those atoms.
a
We are
beautiful
those atoms.
thing.
It's beautiful. Yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing at
We
all.
literally are the universe waking up and personified and looking at itself and figuring out what are we going to do from here. I mean, yeah, there's no overseer with some kind of ultimate purpose in mind for us, but that just means that we're not pawns in some kind of ultimate chess game or something like that. It's really up to us. I mean, if there is such a thing as really becoming a responsible agent, it's in realizing this, that it's up to us and like facing, what Peterson calls the void openly and honestly, and facing the void with courage and really being able to be like, okay, it's only us, but we're going to make it good and we're going to make it great and we're going to fight for it because it really matters. And we are the earth. When environmentalists are pissed because people are destroying the earth, like that is the voice of the earth crying out through these people like, no, this is not okay. Things have to change, and that's why we can't just dismiss these people and tell them to like go clean their room and shit like that. It's a major problem. And so maybe this is the last point, right? Okay, so by now, to swing back around real quick and to touch on this point about, hey, it's in the map, Tetra arising all the way down. Well, by now I'll have a video called Davidian versus Wilberian integral. And I'll have an upgraded map that I will have put out for people that includes this more emergentist perspective. And I think this idea of Tetra arising all the way down, all the way back is one of the ideas that get weeded out of integral with peer review.
Yeah, that's great. I think this map is like desperately needed in integral community. So I can't wait to see it myself, and I'm sure Mario will take a look at it when it comes out.
Yeah, and I think we're also going to potentially have some kind of a further dialogue with Mario. I think that was what he was wanting to do. So now that we've put this out, we've said these things, maybe next is to have some kind of a dialogue with Mario.
Yeah, so Mario, if you're open, we can hit each other up and maybe we can have like a three-way discussion, right?
Yeah, let's have a three-way, Mario. Are you down? You down for the three-way, buddy? Okay, so do you want to rate this thing? Be done with it?
Okay, so I'm gonna give Mario a 4-star response.
Very nice.
The only reason, like you mentioned at the beginning, I mean, there are like two reasons for me. One is that he hasn't shown his personality, so I don't really know who he is, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but maybe he should say something a little bit about himself so I would get a feel for who he really is. It's hard to just get it when he's just countering the arguments. And again, another one is overselling Jordan. I would call that integral projection, and I think his understanding of integral theory is a bit more idealistic, and this is the reasons for 4 stars. Other than that, he seems to be incredibly intelligent. The fact that he was doing all this while he was driving a freaking truck, great job. I probably wouldn't be able to do that. So yeah, 4 stars. And you?
Well, I'm calling it transrational projection, so we're going to have to figure out what our terminology is. We got to get our terms straight, man.
Yeah, we should, yeah.
Okay, I'm not saying that your term isn't better. I'm just saying we gotta rein it in. Okay, so I'm gonna also give him a 4. I think last time, I gave him like a 3 or a 3.5. But in the light of watching the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson talks, I'm feeling a little bit more gracious towards his perspective. I think I've come around to liking Peterson a little bit more, which makes me more sympathetic to what Mario is talking about here. Again, I'm gonna take off a little bit of points again because I would have liked to just get a little bit more of the personality of Mario because he seems like a cool guy. And I would have liked to have heard a little bit more from him about, in terms of straw manning, right? It would have been nice for a little bit of a straw man on the front end for Mario, where he's like, hey guys, I enjoyed your thing. I like this part. This was good. I agree with you about this. That would have been...
You mean steel man, not straw man.
Yes, no straw manning.
You said straw manning, that's steel.
Yeah, so a little bit of steel manning in the front would have been good like that. And if we would have got that at the front, this would be a 5-star thing for me, because the rest of his talk was, like I said, he's really well spoken. He's a really smart guy. I like the way that he broke up the videos.
That was really cool too. I was impressed, yeah. It was also easier for us. Everybody who's doing this kind of responses.
Take notes from Mario.
Take notes from Mario. Yeah.
There's a lot. I think there's a lot that can be learned from this Mario talk, and that's part of why I wanted it to do it too, because I think it's important to show that we're willing to engage in a further conversation, and that it's not just like we see ourselves as being attacked. But I think this topic of transrational projection or integral projection or whatever, this kind of integral benefit of the doubt, whatever we want to call it, this is a common problem in our community, and it's one that I've never seen anybody talk talk about. But it really needs to be something that has a name and we can point to it in the future. And so if there's a real diamond in this talk that comes out of all of this, I hope that it's this. It's this idea of giving people more credit than they're due, and also not just the importance of getting your own good map for yourself, but also understanding multiple perspectives, the importance of keeping these different kind of philosophical archetypes in your head, and also being willing to engage with people right where they're at and not giving them more credit than they're actually due, but really seeing them for who they are.
Yeah, and ironically, when we are doing that, for instance, when we're doing this projection to other people, for instance, Mario is giving Jordan, he's basically overselling Jordan Peterson, but at the same time, he's also underselling himself, because again, Mario, you're smarter than Jordan is based on what you're saying, right? So that's another problem with projecting. So. Yeah. Instead of actually saying, well, this is my opinion, you're overselling Jordan as if you're trying to speak through him. Just say, hey, this is my opinion, because I am more integrally informed than obviously Jordan is.
Yeah, I want to hear what Mario's projects are. I want to see more Mario videos. I'd love to see. I mean, he's a smart guy. I want to see him get more involved in general. I want to see what his ideas about all this stuff are, and for him to throw his hat on the table. And maybe it starts with stuff like this. These kind of criticisms.
Well, sometimes sometimes you need a start, right?
Yeah, I mean,
we'll see what the future brings.
Mario, you're doing great, man. We love you. We're so happy that we could engage with you on this level. I hope that you don't hear this as just a bunch of criticism, but some real honest engagement and feedback into the hard work that you've put in, and we certainly appreciate your feedback. Don't let us make you think that that's not the case.
And I have a tremendous respect for Mario. He was driving a truck, he was talking to us, obviously he's well-read, he was speaking quite clearly, so yeah, I have nothing but praise for him. And again, thank you for taking your time to listening to us for 3 hours. The Jordan Peterson was for me by far the hardest podcast we did so far.
Oh yeah.
And for you to take your time, record all this shit and send it to us, again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks Mario. We really appreciate your engagement, and we look forward to future engagement with you.
Okay, so this is the end of our 5th episode of Integral Review. So David, I know that you are extremely busy. Do you have anything to say before we end?
Yeah, we have some other projects coming out. Probably by now we will have already released our previous podcast to this, which is going to be the one on the pickup community. So if you haven't heard that one yet, make sure you go back and check that one out.
We also made integral map or evolution of pickup map, so it would be useful for anybody who's interested in such things.
The map that goes with it that Aljoša made, he's the master of that podcast. He also had a psychedelic podcast before that. And if you haven't heard the Peterson podcast, what are you doing? What are you doing with your life? Go watch that, you crazy person. Also, make sure you check out that Davidian versus Wilberian video that I mentioned just a little bit ago. That will definitely put a little bit of fire under the integral community, and we can start to have some more talks and refine together around some of this stuff. That's super important.
Because I do feel that's probably the major issue in integral community, or the most important issue.
And we got to lead by example. We got to step out and put our work on the table and be like, peer review this. This is what I think is right. Let's actually make some progress. Don't just complain that there's no progress. We got to actually do it. So that's what I'm trying to do. And I really would invite everyone to work on that with me.
So for everybody who wants to follow us, there will be links for our social media. You can just check them out in the description below.
Make sure you smash like, subscribe, and ring that bell.
Exactly. All those sweet things. Again, follow us. And that's pretty much it.
That's it.
Till next time.
Peace.
Peace.